Have you ever tried to explain a hobby that you have to somebody else who doesn't share that interest? You know, maybe for you, like it's stamp collecting or train spotting, where you sit out there and you watch the trains go by and you write down the exact number and the time that they went by, and you're talking to somebody else and you're trying to explain how cool it is that 4556, it came at 4 o'clock yesterday and 4:05 today, and they're giving you the look. The look that I get from Sarah often. Polite indifference. Now I'm concerned, I just want to say up front, I don't want to see that look from any of you today, because I'm about to preach to you about one of my personal hobbies. Today's sermon has to do with apologetics, which is the rational, intellectual side of why we believe what we believe. And I want you all to bear with me, because this, I don't feel it's something that should be viewed as like a side hobby that some pastors have. That's certainly not what Jesus meant when he said that we are to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. You are to think as his follower. Historically, many of the great minds of history found their foundation in the church. And even out here in the Midwest, years ago, you find records of these groups of farmers who during the winter didn't have as much to do. And so they got together and had a series of debates on theological issues. And these are men who never went to a seminary, but they loved God with their minds. So I want you to bear with me today. I want you to think. Take notes if it helps. Maybe even go back and watch this online. If you don't get it the first time, this is important. We've been talking about sharing your faith. And at some point, if you're telling people about Jesus, you are going to run into somebody who says either, I'm not sure if there is a God out there at all, or yes, I'm pretty sure there is no God at all. I want to remind you, when you're having a conversation with somebody like that, start off by not getting offended. You would not believe how many people I talk to, especially if they're atheists, that are very hesitant to talk to Christians, period, because they're scared of what a response to them will be. Look, Stephen took a few rocks to the head for sharing the gospel. You can deal with somebody who believes differently. Remember that God really wants us to understand people, to be quick to listen and slow to speak. So I want you to consider, right at the start, the world presented by atheism. If there is no God, then in the beginning an accident exploded, and then over time things cooled down and stars and planets formed and life kind of just happened. There is no great beyond, no sweet by and by. There is just matter, energy, and the laws of physics. And that's all there is. There's nothing beyond that. And if this is true, then human beings were not created in the image of God. We're just very clever apes with large brains that we use to make memes and new dance moves. And if this is true, we have no real purpose and no real intent, and we're just here. We are basically computers that are made out of meat. And when our lives end, it is no more tragic than a wind-up toy that slowly stops. And there's no greater value to human life than the value of the life of one of those weird cricket things that are coming into your house this time of year that you kill whenever you see them. This is what a world with no God looks like. And I want you to think about that and consider that, because to say that this is the reality of the world is to disregard what almost everyone, everywhere has always thought to be true. So a question I'd love to pose to an atheist is, why do you do the right thing? Why do you try and live a good life? I mean, the idea of moral values are simple enough. There are some things that you should do, and there are some things that you should not do. And the question is, are these values real and objective, or are they just in our heads and subjective? Let me explain what I mean. To say that something is a subjective thing, it's like your opinion, something that exists only in your mind that is basically pretend. Like I'll say for myself, right? I hate the music of Taylor Swift. I really do. I really feel that way. I can't stand it at all, but that is my opinion, and it's not the same for everyone. There is no cosmic constant someday that they'll discover that will validate my opinion. That's not a feature of the universe. It's my opinion. It's subjective. We all might have different opinions. Now, to say that something is objective means that it is real. It exists outside of your thoughts and beliefs and feelings. Math is real and objective. And many people discover that this time of year when they have interactions with the IRS. Because if you come to different conclusions than the IRS about the math of your finances, they're not going to accept alternative facts. They're not just going to agree to disagree. They're going to say, no, you are actually wrong, and possibly owe us money. There's a right and a wrong answer to 2 plus 2. And even if all of human civilization were to burn to the ground, this would still be true. Even if everybody in the world were to believe differently, this would still be true. And so let's think about morals then. If the difference between right and wrong is subjective and relative, that means that everybody kind of has their own sense of what's right for me might not be right for you, and what's wrong for you might not be wrong for me. But if it's objective and real, then some things will be wrong, even if the whole world says they are right. And some things will be right for you to do, regardless of how you feel about it. Now, this is the point that Christians often kind of veer off and get something very, very wrong. Because maybe you've heard something like this. Oh, well, if we say there is no God, and if we allow people to believe like that, then people are just going to go crazy. Right? Then atheists, they're going to do horrible things. They're going to murder, and they're going to steal, and they're going to put peeps on pizza because anything goes if there is no God. And yet, when we look around, I know this is horrible, right? Only atheism could create that. Yet when we look around, we don't see that happening. If you look at England, largely atheist by this point, right? Their crime rates are not terribly different than our own. There's a very simple explanation for this. Romans chapter 2, 14 and 15, Paul is writing about Gentiles, people who did not have the laws of God in the Old Testament. He says, indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. And so Paul writes about these people. He says, look, the Gentiles, they don't have the Ten Commandments, right? But even they know that it is wrong to kill because God has written his laws, not just on tablets of stone, but he's written them on our hearts, so that everyone, everywhere, is born with an understanding of the difference between good and evil. And this is true for atheists as well. And it kind of begs the question because, they misunderstand. They have like these billboards atheists will put out. Say, millions are good without God. I can be good without God. I don't need God in order to live a good moral life. But you're misunderstanding the question. The question isn't, can you be good? It's, why? Why would you try to be good? To find an atheist living a careful moral life, imagine if you find somebody doing an awkward little shuffle dance down the street of Mammoth, and short steps here, big steps there, and you ask them what they're doing. And they say, when I was a kid, you see, I was told that if you step on a crack, you break your mother's back. And you see, now I've grown up, and I know that that's not the case. But even so, I'm living my entire life, and I'm never going to step on a crack. And you're going to say, why? If you don't think it's true, why are you doing that? That's so silly. The question is not, can you avoid the cracks? It's why are you even trying? Why are you following what you believe to be a made-up rule? And so you might ask somebody who says that there is no God, have you ever had the chance to steal and not get caught? I think pretty much all of us have been there. You're hungry in the back aisle of Casey's, and man, they got the candy right there, and you could probably take it and not get caught. Why? Why didn't you? And you're not worried about having to answer to some God in the afterlife, right? And you knew it was wrong. This is something that atheism provides no good answers for. And so, again, buckle on. We're going to charge. This is a logical argument. All right, I'm going to give you an example of what I mean, okay? Here's how you present a logical argument. You make a few points, and then you have a conclusion. Let me give you an example. Point one, if all cats are evil, they should be destroyed. All right, and then I make a second point. All cats are evil. You can see where I'm going with this. Therefore, all cats should be destroyed. Now, if you're dealing with a logical argument, the third point just follows from the first two. So if you don't like my conclusion, you like cats, all right, and you don't think they should be destroyed, you have to disprove either the first one or the second one. I personally don't think you can. But we're not talking about cats here. Okay, so that's what a logical argument looks like. So here is what it looks like when we talk about why do people try and be good if there is no God. First point, if God does not exist, real moral values do not exist. Point two, real moral values do exist. Therefore, God exists. Write this on a napkin at lunch with somebody. Type it in a text and ask them, what they think of it. At the very least, you're going to have a very interesting conversation. And here's the thing. If you want to avoid that third point that an atheist, of course, would take issue with, then you have to either say that number one is false or number two is false. Because if both of those are true, the third follows from it. So let's deal with the first one. Can you have real moral values in a world where there is no God and there's just matter and energy and the laws of physics and that's all? Think back to what that world looks like. We have no soul, if that's the case. There's nothing that happens after death. There's no guiding force to the universe at all. Atheist Richard Dawkins describes this universe as having no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. In such a world, how can it be that the difference between right and wrong is somehow part of the universe? Consider, for instance, there's a rule in football that made this catch by Des Bryant not a catch versus the Green Bay Packers. I'm still sore about this. Clearly, you see, it's a catch. But there's some rule in football that somebody made up and said, oh, it's not a catch. Now, is that rule a part of the fundamental nature of the universe? No! It is a game that humans invented. And I think they're going to change it this season. They should. But how can it be? It's something unique to human beings. A rule that we just made up and can decide to change if we want. We're not messing with the forces of nature itself by changing the catch rule. And so again, in a world where there is no God and we just die and that's it, how can we say that rules determining how human beings should behave and treat each other are somehow part of the fabric of the universe? It makes no sense. Now remember that most people still, though, feel very strongly that there is a difference between good and evil. And so an atheist at this point will very often try to count, well, here's how or why we feel there's a difference between right and wrong. They might say, well, we get moral values because of how we evolved in human beings. As they evolved, and those who didn't kill each other as much, they evolved more, and that's how we got it. The question there, though, is, what about sexual assault? Right? Because you look at orangutans, and orangutans, most of the time when a male meets a female, he forces her to mate. And the only determining factor is if she's strong enough to fight him off. And so the question is, well, if that's just the way he's wired, what if a male human being is born with the same genetic impulse? Are you saying that it is wrong for him to do the same thing? If you are, then you're appealing to something greater than your DNA that determines what you should or should not do. And they say, oh, well, we get our sense of right and wrong from society, the culture around us. We pass laws and we say, hey, you shouldn't do that. And that's why where we get right and wrong from. So then another question, well, what about societies that exist in the world today, cultures where the rape and abuse of young boys is an accepted cultural practice? That is the case, as it was in ancient Rome. Are you going to say that their culture is wrong and your culture is right? If you do, you're saying that there's something greater than our culture that binds our behavior, even if we all agree that something is right. You're appealing to something beyond culture. Then they might say, well, we should all do what's in self-interest, because if we all go around stealing and murdering and putting peeps on pizza, the world would just be a terrible place. And so it's in our own self-interest to do this stuff. Another question. So if you're saying that I should help other people because they might help me, then what if the people here recently at a mass shooting who throw their bodies in front of other people to spare their lives and themselves die? I mean, if I'm saving your life, right, and I'm dying in the process, well, how are you going to pay me back? Right? If there's no God and I'm just dead and I'm done with it, there's no self-interest there. I get nothing out of that. I'm just dead and that's it. And if that's the case, then that is the most foolish thing I could possibly do. And yet, if you're going to say that it is a right and noble thing to sacrifice yourself to save others, you're saying that there is something greater than our self-interest. Besides, saying that we get our moral values from culture, genetics, or self-interest doesn't make them real. You're just saying why you feel that way. It doesn't make your feelings real. And besides, I could make a set of rules to live by that everybody in the world, everywhere, could agree to, all right? We would go, number 1, don't be a jerk. And number 2, stop with the stupid kissy faces when you're taking pictures of yourself. And I think everybody, everywhere, could agree, okay, these are the rules we are going to live by, but that doesn't make them real. It doesn't make them binding on anyone, because if I go to one of our teenage girls and she's taking a duck face picture and say, no, you shouldn't do that, what's she going to say to me? Says who? What gives me the authority to determine for other people what is right and wrong? Just because you agree on a set of rules doesn't make them objective and real. And so at the end of it, pretty much every intellectual atheist out there agrees that in a world where there is no God, the difference between good and evil does not exist. It's not a real thing. You might feel it, but it's just a feeling unique to you. Here's a quote by Richard Dawkins again. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. So if we have a hard time disproving the first point, what about this second one? So you say, okay, there's no God, there's no difference between right and wrong, really, beyond our own feelings. Then the second one, do real moral values exist? And I think this is a far easier one to have a discussion about. Just ask somebody and say, is evil a real thing in the world? Or is it just an illusion? Is evil a real thing? Because every human culture out there, when you talk about right and wrong, they disagree on the small stuff. What parts of your body need to be covered, how to handle taxes. Everybody disagrees on the small stuff, but there's no human culture that views murder as a casual thing, or stealing as totally cool. No human society in all of the history has ever said that everyone should do whatever they want. In fact, if you look at human cultures and society, we seem obsessed with the idea of telling people exactly what they should do and what they shouldn't do. And so for you to say, well, all of that is just an illusion, you're saying like every human culture of all time has basically been fundamentally wrong in the way they look at the world. That is a fantastic claim. Where is your evidence? There is none. Now, sometimes people act as though there are no real moral values. the end of the book of Judges, you'll find a few chapters of crazy, sinful, evil behavior. And at the end of it, it kind of gives a summary for why this is happening. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And it says, yes, everybody was running around and saying, well, if this feels right to me, I'm going to do it, and I don't care what anybody else thinks. And for a while here in America, I think in like the 60s and 70s, you had this thing, moral relativism came out. And everybody was saying, well, what's right for you is right for you, and you just do that. And what's right for me is right for me, and I'm just going to do that, and we'll leave each other alone. What I find fascinating when you look at the news today is we have abandoned this way of thinking. It used to be what people thought, but now the same people who 30, 40 years ago were saying there's no such thing as evil or good, now they're walking around with signs like this. Now, whether you disagree or agree with the sign, what's interesting is they're making a moral judgment. They're not just saying, oh, I disagree with you, and that's totally okay. You're doing what you think is fine. No! No, they're saying, yo, you're really evil. I don't care what you think, you're evil. And the other side says, well, you're evil. And I'm like, oh, okay, now everybody agrees. Evil is a thing. Thank you. And again, when you make a moral judgment like this, you're saying that there is a standard, a universal standard that somebody is breaking. Whether it be the president or liberals or Harvey Weinstein, you're saying that evil is a real thing. I hear in the news lately, there was a teacher who had a sick puppy, and he fed it live to a snapping turtle in class. And yes, a number of people very, very shocked by it. Oh, how horrible. And you might ask an atheist, what if it had been a sick child instead of a dog? Would you be totally cool with that? I mean, if you're saying that evil's not a thing, then you're saying, in essence, there's no difference between him feeding a worm or a puppy or a young child to the snapping turtle because, again, we're just computers made out of meat, right? If there's no real difference between right and wrong, then it wouldn't be really wrong. You might say, well, I don't like it. And if they push the point, and they say, oh, no, there's no real difference between right and wrong. It's all just opinion. And I want you at that point to punch them in the nose and take their wallet. I mean, take their wallet and be like, wow, that made me really happy. And what are they going to say? That's wrong! They're not going to say, oh, I totally respect that your sense of morality is slightly different than my own. No, they're going to say, no, that's wrong for you to do. You can't do that. When you stop pushing your morals on them. Remember, that's your own view. Again, pretty much the whole world right now is looking at chemical weapons being used on civilians and children being bombed in Syria and saying this is a terrible evil that is taking place. Evil is a real thing. Even people who do wrong things, take thieves, for instance, people who steal, universally, if you talk to them, they usually go to great lengths to justify why they're stealing. Well, you see, what had happened was, and I really needed the money for this or that. And what they're saying is not, oh, stealing isn't wrong, it's totally fine. What they're saying is, well, stealing is normally wrong. But you see, in this case, what I did was right. Even thieves acknowledge, thou shalt not steal, most of the time. And yet, if you say that, yes, evil is a real thing, it leads you back to the same problem. How? How can it be if there is nothing beyond this material world that evil would be a concept at all? How can you allow that this is a real thing in a godless, pitiless, uncaring world? And it creates this horrible tension. for those who are honest and struggle with these questions. Let me just read you a quote from an atheist who is struggling with this issue. He says, "As things now stand, everything is up for grabs. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. Those who stood up to and died resisting Hitler, Stalin, Amen, and Pol Pot and General Custer too have earned salvation. Those who acquiesce deserve to be damned. There is in the world such a thing as evil. All together now, says who?" So where does that lead us? If we cannot have a real difference between right and wrong in a universe with no God, and there is definitely a difference between right and wrong, then it uncomfortably for many people points to that conclusion, which is that there is a God, except if you're having this conversation with somebody, I want you to understand this, church. The point is not to argue with somebody and prove that you're smarter than them, or you've got this really clever argument, or even that you're just aiming for them to acknowledge, maybe there is a God. What you're doing, and you can't argue people into the kingdom of God. God is the one who saves. And the purpose of having any kind of a conversation like this is you're just trying to clear away the bushes. You're trying to remove the obstacles they might have to faith. And a lot of times what you do is you expose the naked truth of the fact that even though all the arguments of the world were presented to me, I do not want there to be a God. And that's fine for you to leave them with. And yet if you get to that point and they're saying, well, where do we go from here? The point of all this is not just to say that good and evil exist, but there is a God who is perfect good, a God who is love. And he has defeated evil, not just general cosmic evil. Our evil he defeated by sending his own Son, like us, to bear the punishment for our evil, for your evil, so that you might be saved. And he calls you to trust him with your life. This is not an armchair discussion. This is a matter of life and death on the eternal side for you. So I hope I have challenged you today to think differently, and sometimes it can be hard, especially if you've grown up in the church and have thought about this your whole life and have just assumed from day one, yes, there is a God out there. Take time to listen to the people around you. Think deeply about your faith. Let's pray. God, I pray that you would fill our mouths with the words that you would have us to speak when we have an opportunity to share the gospel, because sometimes we are going to share a verse or a personal story of how you've impacted our life, and yet there are other times when somebody has a very specific intellectual problem with their faith, and pray that in those moments that you would help your people to have prepared themselves beforehand, to have thought deeply and considered these things, and that you would help us to make these things clear. That believing you is not just wishful thinking. Is the only way that I know how to make sense of this universe that we see. In Jesus' name, amen.